bit about characteristics of persons with autism and also how autism is diagnosed. And it's really important that we realize as we get into that discussion that every person is unique. And so there are certain characteristics that persons with autism typically share or may share. But it's most important that we begin this conversation by realizing you can't, study from a book everything there is to know about people with autism and then think that we're going to be really effective and pastoral with them. Because every person is unique, and we've got to get to know the person as well. At the same time, it does help us to understand how autism is classified and what are particular characteristics. Current diagnostic systems tend to focus on deficits. So for me as a clinical child psychologist, this is something that I struggle with. Our diagnostic systems come very firmly out of the medical community, and in medicine things are about symptoms and diagnosis. And the way that we diagnose disabilities such as autism and psychological issues and things like that comes out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This manual was recently updated over the summer. This is what's used pretty much across the board for diagnosis of psychological kinds of issues. And knowing common characteristics can assist us sometimes in anticipating and meeting the needs of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It can at least give us a framework of reference when we begin to meet people and talk with families and learn more about the unique person. So one thing that may be new to you is, depending on your level of experience with autism, is even the term autism spectrum disorder. This has really come into favor in the autism community over the last several years, but what's different now in terms of diagnosis is that what used to be considered several different autism spectrum disorders have now been lumped under one category diagnostically. So we used to have, for example, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we used to have something called autistic disorder. We had something else called Asperger's disorder, and you've probably heard the term Asperger's. Pervasive developmental disorder was another term that was used. All of those diagnoses officially in the medical community have gone away. In this edition 5 that came out this summer of the DSM, this is all now called autism spectrum disorder. It's all under one umbrella. So in some ways that might be helpful, in other ways it's not so helpful. And I want to just reference that a little bit because that reclassification sometimes can result in differences in eligibility for services, for example. And also it can cause some confusion for families. Families sometimes have kind of taken up a name like Asperger's, for example, just because I work with a lot of folks in the Asperger's community and I know what a big deal this is for them. And so that becomes part of the identity or the way that they describe, say, for example, the difference between their child and another child who might be in a different place on the spectrum. And so this reclassification has in some ways caused some confusion. But there are other pieces of it that are helpful, and we'll talk about some of the characteristics that we find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So there are two domains that we look at now under the current diagnostic system that are domains of particular challenge for many people with autism spectrum disorder. The first domain is called social communication or social interaction issues. And under this domain, there are some typical characteristics, and in order to meet criteria for diagnosis, they have to have 2 out of 3 of these characteristics. So, and those characteristics have to do, again, with social communication and social interaction. So some challenges in being able to communicate socially, to being able to interact with others. One thing that we call reciprocity, which is this ability to have a reciprocal interaction that requires in some cases, getting inside the head of the other person, really understanding kind of how they're perceiving what we're saying, giving them a context of reference, those kinds of things are particularly challenging for people on the spectrum. And again, this is a spectrum, and so you heard Anne referring to people being highly involved on the spectrum or moderately involved on the spectrum. What we mean by that is to say that some of these challenges are greater for some people on the spectrum than others. And so the social communication, for example, is much more difficult in a child who might be very highly involved and is not very verbal. And it might, as they're gaining more language, become a little easier and better facilitated. Or, as we make some modifications that allow them to communicate better as well. This domain also is going to relate to things like awareness of nonverbal cues and signals, being able to read the body language of somebody else, being able to read the facial expressions accurately. I find that a lot of the children that I work with on the spectrum have a very hard time telling when somebody is serious and when somebody's joking, or have a very hard time telling the difference between somebody being playful and somebody who's actually angry and saying, you need to stop what you're doing right now. Those kinds of things are challenging for them to read. And so because of that, sometimes the response that they give back is an inappropriate response for the context and begins to cause them more difficulties. So the other domain has to do with restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. And this particular domain, for diagnosis, it's required that kids have 3 out of 4 characteristics. And some of those have to do with fixed interests. So we might find that there are many children on the spectrum that have a very, very, very high interest in one or only a couple of areas. And that can vary depending on the child. So, if you're working with a child on the spectrum, it's usually very good to know what their big interest is if they have one of those fixed high interests, because sometimes that's also becomes a good bridge to communication with them, because that's our kind of doorway. If you want to engage with this child, you need to know something about trains, or whatever the big interest might be. And we'll also see in some cases a very high connection with a particular routine, or needing to do certain things the same way over and over again. And part of that has to do, I think, with some of the comfort that's found for persons on the spectrum in those routines. When the world can be a little hard to read and a little unpredictable, if I'm doing the same thing the same way each time, it makes me feel a little more comfortable with the world. And so that's another part of this domain. Also falling within this domain that doesn't probably seem to relate to patterns, restricted patterns of behavior, but also falling within this domain now, for the first time, is sensory processing issues. This is something that's certainly been observed in many, many children on the spectrum, but it hasn't been well described in our past diagnostic systems. And so now we have that included in this system, in the new DSM-5. And when we talk about sensory processing issues, we talk about differences in how kids perceive what they hear, what they see. Other senses might also be involved, touch. And so some kids, for example, are very tactile defensive. And I keep speaking of kids because I'm a child psychologist, but this is true for many adults as well. Tactile defensiveness is an issue. And so what might just feel like a light touch to us feels painful in some ways in terms of how it's perceived. So we might find that children with tactile defensiveness are very bothered by certain fabrics, are very bothered by touch in a way that other children might not be. Just a hand on the shoulder might be very aversive to some of those children. On the other hand, on the other side of that, we have kids who are sensory craving. And so they need more sensory stimuli. And so for some of those kids in the tactile area, what they need is just a lot of touch, or a lot of, they like to be squeezed, they like, you know, having a blanket wrapped around them and things like that. So we also see kids on the spectrum whose sensory processing issues take that form as well. We don't really fully understand where this comes from, but neurologists that I've spoken with say that the operating theory is that it has something to do with the way that nerve information reaches the brain. So the information from our nervous system taken in through the senses reaches the brain. So for example, for kids that are defensive, have auditory defensiveness, that have trouble with sound, which is very common in people on the spectrum, that sounds that seem ordinary to us or just a little noisy are very aversive, and they have to cover their ears. For those individuals, they may perceive the sound, they may hear the sound the same way we do, but then the perception in the brain is magnified. So the sound feels much louder for those individuals. So this is the sensory processing issues that we see. Another domain is another area where we see challenge, as I mentioned, is in language, and this particular challenge has been moved to a different category in the DSM called social pragmatic communication disorder, and this is particularly pertinent to children and adults that have some problems with social communication, or understanding somebody's perspective, or being able to speak within context. We sometimes will see some repetitive use of language, or what we call echolalia, where just fragments of language are picked up and then used to communicate. Sometimes that echolalia serves a function in terms of, so individuals might be repeating something that they heard someone else say, but they might be trying to tell us something by saying that. Or repeating a line out of a movie because they're not sure exactly how to express themselves, but for some reason in their perception, that particular line carries the message that they want to deliver. And so I wouldn't, sometimes there are clinicians that will describe echolalia as if it's non-functional, and that's not necessarily my experience. I think that it does serve a communication function. But we sometimes will see those individuals using language in a different way than typically developing children. So some of these individuals might be diagnosed with social or pragmatic communication disorder as well. So for in the area of language, one of the things that we sometimes will find is helpful with individuals on the spectrum will be communication systems that allow them to be able to express themselves non-verbally, or with some shortcuts that facilitate that process for them. The picture exchange system, or PEX system, is one system that's been used a lot. You might be able to, I doubt you can read these words down here, but it says, I want, and then there's a blank. And then it says, big wheel, golf, trampoline, bubble blower, sand and water table, and sidewalk chalk. We find that especially for individuals who are very involved on the spectrum, it can be extremely frustrating to want to say something and not really be able to express it. And so this is just a sample card that was given for a child to be able to show, this is the fun thing I want to do right now. And to be able to express that so that people know and can respond. We can also adapt some of these systems to do some of the things we like to do in catechesis as well, and there'll be some mention of that a little bit later. So this would be the picture exchange communication system, picture boards, binders, photographs, sign language, and gestures are some of the methods of communication that we might use for individuals on the spectrum. And these would be more in the low-tech, and tells me, kind of sense. We can also, there are some high-tech communication devices for persons on the spectrum. And so these are some of some samples of some of the augmented communication devices. And these would have pictures where sometimes you can press a button and it will say a word. So these devices help persons with autism who might be nonverbal or might have limited verbal ability actually speak audibly to others around them as well by pointing to and pressing the buttons or the pictures. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off now again to Anne, who's going to talk about some of the functions of behavior for persons on the spectrum.